On the island of Manhattan, at the intersection of 5th Avenue and Broadway at 23rd Street, is a public square named after the fourth President of the United States, James Madison. In 1874, the world's greatest showman, P.T. Barnum, built a structure nearby that he named the Great Roman Hippodrome, where he exhibited Jumbo, his world-famous giant elephant. 5 years later, the arena was renamed Madison Square Garden. Because the original garden had no roof, it was too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, so it was closed in 1889 and later demolished. However, in 1890, the second Madison Square Garden was opened, and it became the second tallest building in New York City and was the largest indoor arena in the world. Despite featuring events like the very first World Heavyweight Championship match in professional wrestling between George Hackenschmidt and Tom Jenkins, the second Madison Square Garden was also a financial failure, and it was eventually torn down in 1925. However, a new arena was opened that year on the west side of 8th Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. Although located in the Bowery and not anywhere near Madison Square, the new venue was once again named Madison Square Garden and was the sports mecca of New York City until 1968. It's also where Marilyn Monroe famously sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" to Kennedy in 1962. However, sadly in 1969, the old garden was also demolished and the skyscraper One World Plaza was built in its place. The newest version of Madison Square Garden opened in 1969 at the site of the original Penn Station in Midtown Manhattan at 4 Pennsylvania Plaza. In the 1920s, George Rickard was the greatest boxing promoter in the world. Because he had actually served as a marshal in the state of Texas during the 1890s and was good friends with Wyatt Earp, everyone called him Tex. Tex was the promoter of legendary fights like Jack Johnson versus Jim Jeffries and Dempsey versus Firpo. The old garden that was in existence from 1925 to 1969 was built by Tex Rickard to stage his fights and was nicknamed the house that Tex built. But just like P.T. Barnum, Tex was always looking for a new way to make a buck. So Tex founded a hockey team in 1926 to play at his new arena. As a pun on his name, the new club was nicknamed Texas Rangers, and the New York Rangers were born. Although Tex knew nothing about hockey, the extraordinary promoter was smart enough to hire the smartest hockey person in the world to run his team, Lester Patrick. The Patrick family has been called hockey's royal family. Lester Patrick was a star defenseman for McGill University, who won the Stanley Cup twice for the Montreal Wanderers 10 years before the establishment of the National Hockey League. In 1911, Lester and his brother Frank formed the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, which was considered to be a major league and would compete against NHL teams for the Stanley Cup each year. The Patrick brothers are both in the Hockey Hall of Fame and introduced many rules that continue to be in existence to this day. The Patrick brothers invented the blue line, the forward pass, the playoffs, the penalty shot. They were the ones first responsible for crediting assists when a goal was scored, and for putting numbers on the back of players' sweaters. In 1926, as a player coach, Lester Patrick's Victoria Cougars became the last non-NHL team to win the Stanley Cup. The Patrick dynasty continues to this day. Lester's grandson, Craig Patrick, was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2001. Craig Patrick was the assistant general manager and assistant coach of the 1980 Miracle on Ice team and was the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins from 1989 to 2006, where he won 2 consecutive Stanley Cups with the great Mario Lemieux and Craig Patrick's Czechoslovakian discovery, Jaromir Jagr. Patrick later drafted Marc-Andre Fleury, Avengé Malkin, and Sidney Crosby for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Another one of Lester Patrick's grandsons, named Dick Patrick, has been the president of the Washington Capitals for the last 40 years and will probably also end up in the Hockey Hall of Fame one day. Under Lester Patrick's leadership as head coach and general manager of the New York Rangers, the team found immediate success, winning the Stanley Cup in 1928 in only the franchise's second year of existence. A mere 5 years later, the Rangers repeated as champions again behind the legendary line of Bill Cook, Bun Cook, and Frank Boucher. For the 1939-1940 season, while remaining as general manager, Lester Patrick stepped aside as coach and was replaced by Frank Boucher. The New York Rangers' 1940 championship season was the sixth and final Stanley Cup of Lester Patrick's career as a player, manager, or coach. One of the stars of the 1940 New York Rangers was Lynn Patrick, who played 10 seasons at left wing for New York and was later inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1980 as a player. Lynn's younger brother, Muzz Patrick, was a low-scoring defenseman who also was on the 1940 Rangers championship team and who famously scored the winning goal in double overtime in Game 6 of the series. However, unlike his famous father, uncle, brother, and nephew, Muzz Patrick was never inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. After Lester Patrick retired in 1940, he was replaced as general manager by Frank Boucher. Although one of the greatest Ranger players in history, Boucher was unable to match the success of his predecessor as general manager. Instead, disappointing season followed disappointing season. Many Rangers fans thought that the team was cursed because after winning the Stanley Cup in 1940, the owners conducted a Madison Square Garden mortgage burning ceremony inside of the cup, which many fans felt defiled the integrity of the trophy. Frank Boucher resigned at the end of the 1954 season and was replaced as general manager by Muzz Patrick. Fiery Phil Watson, who had led the 1940 Rangers in scoring during the playoffs, was hired by his old teammate Muzz Patrick to be the Rangers' new head coach. One of the first moves made by Muzz as GM was to poach Jimmy Bartlett from the Montreal Canadiens in the 1955 interleague draft. After 13 consecutive losing seasons, the 1955-56 New York Rangers, under the leadership of the new GM and coach, won almost twice as many games as the year before and made it to the playoffs. Unfortunately, they were eliminated in the first round by the eventual champions, the Montreal Canadiens. In the next season, again, the Rangers made the playoffs, but once again were bounced in the first round by the eventual champions, the Montreal Canadiens. In the 1957-58 season, the Rangers had the second best regular season record in the league. However, once again, in the first round of the playoffs, they got upset by the Boston Bruins, who eventually lost in the finals to the Montreal Canadiens, who won their third consecutive Stanley Cup that year. At the end of the season, the New York Rangers lost three of their forwards to the intra-league draft. Jean-Guy Gendron was poached by the Boston Bruins, while Dave Creighton and Danny Lewicki were drafted by the Montreal Canadiens. Montreal never had any intent for Creighton or Lewicki to ever play for Montreal, and neither of them ever played for the team. Instead, Montreal was just using sleazy tactics in order to weaken their biggest competition in the league. Nevertheless, Phil Watson felt it deep down in his bones that in 1958-59, the Rangers would finally win their first Stanley Cup since 1940. The undisputed star of the team was the great right winger, number 9, the 26-year-old Andy Bathgate. The year before, Bathgate scored 30 goals and came in second for MVP of the league behind the great Gordie Howe. In the 1958-59 season, the future Hall of Famer scored 40 goals and had the best year of his career. He became the first New York Ranger to grace the cover of Sports Illustrated and was named the league's most valuable player. When he was asked who was the best teammate he ever had during his long career, Jimmy Bartlett didn't hesitate. The answer was Andy Bathgate. Andy's centerman on his line was the Pope, Larry Popine. Popine was the best defensive forward on the team and was utilized by Phil Watson as the team's primary penalty killer. In 1960, the Pope went to Vancouver in the Western Hockey League, where he starred for 7 seasons. Bathgate's left winger was Dean Prentice. Prentice played 22 seasons in the NHL and is probably the best player from the original 6 era not to be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, despite the fact that he played in 5 All-Star games and scored 20 goals on 10 occasions. If Prentice had played for the Canadians or the Maple Leafs, there's no doubt that he would have been inducted into the Hall of Fame many years ago. Playing center on the team's second line was Red Sullivan, the Rangers captain. Although never a star, Red had his best season ever in 1958 when he scored 21 goals. Red was a friendly, fun-loving guy who was very popular with his teammates. He loved the Manhattan nightlife and was known as a guy who would break a few curfews now and then. Red Sullivan almost died after getting speared by Doug Harvey in a game against the Canadians. His injury was so bad that he was given last rites by a Catholic priest. At left wing on the second line was Jimmy's old teammate from the Providence Reds, Camille Henry. In the early 1950s, the Eel was the star player for the junior Quebec Citadels when Phil Watson was their coach. Camille Henry was always grateful that Phil Watson was his coach in junior. Because Camille Henry was a French Canadian and could not speak English when he played junior, it was a great help for him to have a French-speaking coach with him with Quebec. After Phil Watson pulled some strings for him, Camille Henry was called up by the New York Rangers, where he defeated the great Jean Beliveau for Rookie of the Year and had 8 seasons with 20 or more goals. At right wing on the second line was Andy Bathgate, who scored 33 goals in 1958, which tied him for 4th in the league. Andy was one of the cleanest players of his era, and the year before won the Lady Byng Award for gentlemanly play. Andy was also the Cal Ripken Jr. of his day. Bathgate had the Iron Man record for playing in 630 consecutive games until it was broken in 1986 by Doug Jarvis. On the blue line, the New York Rangers had Hall of Famer Harry Howell. Howell was the last defenseman to win the Norris Trophy during the original 6 era. Harry Howell played 17 seasons for the New York Rangers, and his number 3 was retired by the team in 2009. The 7-time All-Star still holds the record for most games played in a New York Rangers uniform. Paired with Harry Howell at defense was Leapin' Louie Fontinato. In 1955, Louie became the very first player in NHL history to have more than 200 penalty minutes in a season. Willing to drop the gloves at any time during a game, Leapin' Louie was considered, going into the 58th season, the reigning heavyweight champion of the NHL. Louie's NHL career tragically ended in 1962 when he broke his neck when crashing into the boards during a game while playing for the Montreal Canadiens. At the ripe old age of 31, defenseman Bill Gadspy was the elder statesman of the team. Gadspy starred for the Chicago Blackhawks for 9 years before being traded to the Rangers in 1954. Nothing in Gadspy's life ever was easy. In 1939, when he was only 12 years old, he was traveling with his mom on a passenger liner when it was hit by a torpedo by a German U-boat and sunk. And in 1952, while playing for Chicago, Gadspy was hospitalized for 3 weeks during the hockey season after contracting polio. Gadspy is also famous for receiving more than 600 stitches to his face during his hockey career. He laughed about that, though, because he actually had an insurance policy which paid him $5 for every stitch he received. Gadspy was a first-team All-Star 3 times in his career and a second-team All-Star 4 times. During the 1958-59 season, the future Hockey Hall of Famer broke the record for most assists in a season by a defenseman. Paired with Bill Gadspy was the 23-year-old rookie, John Hanna, who eventually played 7 years in the American Hockey League for the Quebec Aces after leaving the Rangers in 1960. Hanna had his best seasons towards the end of his career playing for the Seattle Totems of the Western Hockey League, where he was twice named League's Best Defenseman and was also the League's Most Valuable Player. The team's goalie, Hall of Famer Gump Worsley, was one of the most popular players to ever put on the pads. Worsley got his famous nickname because he resembled a character in a comic strip. This, along with the fact that he was only 5'7" and was overweight, made him a comical figure. Like Jimmy Bartlett, Gump Worsley played junior hockey for Verdun and was Bartlett's teammate the year before in Providence until he was able to beat Johnny Bower for the starting position with the Rangers. Gump's comical look was matched by his eccentric personality. In his early days with New York, when facing 30 to 40 shots a night with a terrible team, a reporter once asked Gump which team gave him the most trouble. Gump quickly answered, the Rangers. Despite collecting over 200 stitches to the face during his career, Worsley was one of the last goalies to never wear a mask. Instead, he joked that his face was his mask. Gump was famously terrified of flying. In the late 1960s, when the NHL was switching primarily to air travel, Worsley suffered a panic attack during a flight and needed to be hospitalized after suffering a nervous breakdown. Despite Gump's reputation of being a fun-loving party animal, the same goalie that ironically would not wear a mask during a game actually suffered from debilitating depression and alcoholism that was hidden by Gump's mask of jocularity. Centering the third line was the 6'2" Hank Sessler. Despite his size, he never developed into a physical type player. Scoring only 6 goals that season, he was traded away and never played again in the NHL. Sessler did find success in the AHL, where he led the league in scoring in 1962 for the Cleveland Barons. Tragically, he died at the young age of 41 of stomach cancer. At right wing on the third line was Les Colwill. The low-scoring winger only played 1 year in the NHL and then retired from hockey for good a year later. In 1958, the New York Rangers only dressed 16 players per game. The roster was made up of 9 forwards making up 3 lines, 4 defensemen, and a goalie. The other 2 players on the roster would be spares, used primarily to kill penalties or to skate a few shifts rotated in on the third line. Center Earl Ingerfield only scored 1 goal in 35 games with the Rangers that year. However, this hard-working grinder was eventually able to secure a permanent roster spot with the Rangers, where he stayed until 1967, and eventually earned a spot on the top line with Bathgate and Prentice. Also receiving limited ice time was a 31-year-old seasoned veteran, Wally Hergesheimer. In the early 50s, Wally scored 20 goals 4 times for the New York Rangers. In 1958, Wally scored 3 goals in 22 games following a call-up from the Buffalo Bisons by the Rangers. After that season, he never played in the NHL again. In 1935, the best hockey prospects in the country were invited by Lester Patrick to attend his new school for potential New York Ranger rookies in Winnipeg. When young prospect Phil Watson checked into his room, he was introduced to his new roommate, Lester Patrick's son, Muzz Patrick. Muzz was a great all-around athlete who played football, basketball, track and field, and some hockey. But unlike his famous father, Lester, his number one love was the sport of boxing. In fact, the year before, Muzz Patrick won the Canadian Amateur Heavyweight Boxing title. The roommates quickly became good friends, and when Muzz became general manager of the Rangers in the mid-50s, the first move he did was hiring his buddy, Phil Watson, and the duo had immediate success, turning the hapless Rangers into Stanley Cup contenders. However, for 3 years in a row, the Rangers were eliminated in the first round of the playoffs. Former NHL tough guys Muzz Patrick and Phil Watson felt that they had the solution to this problem heading into the 58-59 season. According to Muzz, we were patsies in the past, all right? In fact, we were so gentle, we nearly got pushed out of the league. Even though Leapin' Louie was the most penalized player in hockey and Red Sullivan had a reputation of being a tough guy, most of the Rangers forwards were perceived as being soft, non-physical type of players. Although Andy Bathgate, Camille Henry, and Dean Prentice were extremely skilled and were contenders for the Lady Byng Award each year, former NHL tough guys Muzz Patrick and Phil Watson wanted to add players cut from the same cloth as themselves. Hard-hitting bangers who were not afraid to drop the gloves. However, unlike teams in the past, Muzz Patrick proudly announced in 1958 that we've got plenty of fight now, and much of the credit belongs to 3 rookies, who were dubbed the Fearsome Threesome. One of the rookies was defenseman John Hanna, who was paired with Bill Gadspy. However, it was the 2 rookie wingers who were hailed as new stars before the season began. Coach Watson predicted them as being the top contenders for Rookie of the Year. Their names were Eddie Shack and Jimmy Bartlett. Before becoming Disney on Ice, the touring ice show was called the Ice Follies And for many years, they featured a novelty act known as Frickin' Frack. Frickin' Frack were a comedic ice skating duo from Switzerland who would perform wild and crazy acrobatic skating tricks on the ice as part of their act. The duo were so popular that Frickin' Frack has become an English slang term used to refer to two people so closely associated as to be indistinguishable. Jimmy Bartlett and Eddie Shack were the Frickin' Frack of the New York Rangers. Just like the world's greatest showman, P.T. Barnum, who started Madison Square Gardens, Bartlett and Shack were determined to put on the best show on Broadway. Muzz Patrick and Phil Watson wanted fearless, tough guys who weren't afraid to drop the gloves and get physical, and that's exactly what they got. Unlike Bathgate, Henry, and Hebington, who finished in the top 5 for Lady Bing that season, the Rangers fans were thrilled by the antics of the fearsome threesome of rookies who broke the NHL record for combined penalty minutes for 3 rookies in a year. In 1958-59, Jimmy Bartlett broke the record for most penalty minutes by a forward in the history of the New York Rangers and had the second most penalty minutes at that time ever for a left wing in the NHL. However, it wasn't just the violence that brought the fans to their feet in Madison Square Garden. Instead, Bartlett and Shack became fan favorites in New York because of their personalities and style. On the ice, Bartlett and Shack were described as being charismatic, excited, magnetic, and most of all, entertaining. Jimmy Bartlett and Eddie Shack were both oddballs, characters, eccentric, colorful personalities who were funny on and off the ice. They both had the reputation of having a few screws loose and not playing with a full deck. Andy Bathgate gave the pair the nickname Nuts and Bolts. When asked which one was nuts, the answer was always both of them. Shack had previously played with Bartlett the year before in Providence, where he scored 16 goals in only 35 games before breaking his leg and missing the remainder of the season. Featuring a very prominent proboscis, Eddie Shack was nicknamed the Nose and was a comical-looking figure, especially when he grew his large mustache later in his career. Eddie Shack was traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1960 and eventually won 4 Stanley Cups with Johnny Bower and played over 1,000 games in the NHL before retiring in 1975. After he retired, Eddie cashed in on his celebrity and made a fortune with endorsements. Eddie Shack was famously nicknamed the Entertainer. When fans would chant, "We want Shack," Eddie would turn around on the bench and, like an orchestra conductor, gesture to the fans to increase the volume. In the occasions that he was announced to be one of the 3 stars of the game, Eddie would skate out to center ice, spin around on one skate like a ballerina performing a pirouette, to the delight of the screaming fans. Eddie Shack became so popular in Toronto that a song was made by a Canadian garage band called The Secrets, named "Clear the Track, Here Comes Shack," that hit the Canadian music charts in 1966.
Clear the track, here comes Shack. He knocks him down and he gives him a whack. He can score goals, he's coming back. Eddie Shack.
Despite the preseason hype and the popularity with the fans, neither Jimmy Bartlett nor Eddie Shack received any votes for Rookie of the Year, which was instead won by Montreal center Ralph Backstrom. Adding insult to injury, despite the fact that Bartlett scored 11 goals that season, by comparison, rookie Norm Johnson of the Boston Bruins received 18 votes for Rookie of the Year, despite only scoring 3 goals, getting traded in the middle of the year, and never playing another game in the NHL. In the spring of 1958, Jimmy's wife Helen gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Christine. Sadly, she was born with a heart condition and never came home from the hospital. Although this tragedy obviously caused emotional devastation to the young parents, during my entire life, my dad never spoke to me about it. Later that summer, Jimmy's softball team won the state championship and they played in a world championship tournament. Also during the summer, Jimmy paid a visit to his old coach, Johnny Crawford of the Providence Reds. After failing to make the New York Rangers after 3 bad training camps in a row, Crawford gave Bartlett a stern talking to and told him to stop screwing around because there's absolutely no reason why he should not be playing in the NHL if he only applied himself. Because Providence had been replaced by Springfield as the affiliated American League team with the Rangers, Crawford warned Bartlett that if he did not make the Rangers at that training camp, he would not be going back to Providence, but would be farmed out to Springfield and the dreaded Eddie Shore, a fate that terrified all young hockey players. Fortunately for Jimmy, Phil Watson and Muzz Patrick were committed to youth, and Bartlett made the team. Fiery Phil Watson was a hothead when he played, and he was a hothead when he coached. For the most part, his players hated him. Camille Henry said that Phil was probably the best coach he ever had in his career, but he did not know how to talk to players. He did not know how to treat them like men. According to Gump Worsley, Phil had one of his whipping boys, and I was one of them. He knew hockey from top to bottom, but he did not know how to handle players. Watson would ridicule Gump Worsley about his being overweight and would tell him that we can't win games with the goalie who has a beer barrel belly. According to the Gump, this just showed what a dope the Rangers had as a coach because he only drank Johnny Walker Red. Phil Watson was extremely high-strung and suffered from ulcers. When he was a player for the New York Rangers, Watson was described as being a 155-pound parcel of dynamite just asking to be detonated. Phil Watson drove his old coach, Lester Patrick, crazy. According to Lester Patrick, Watson gets into too many fights and too much trouble. Phil's the most eccentric, dynamic, unstoppable player I've coached in a lifetime of hockey. But something seems to snap inside his head when there's a flare-up on the ice and he just can't stay out of a fight. Anybody's fight. But I'm afraid to caution him too much because I might cure him. Jimmy Bartlett was Phil Watson's pet project, and Phil felt about Jimmy the same way his coach Lester Patrick felt about him. According to Watson, Bartlett's a screwball. I remember him in junior. He was a defenseman then with St. Jerome in the Quebec Junior A League. He was the dirtiest player in the league. I always admired him, but you gotta control him or he'll go wild. I always liked his potentials. He always could skate and shoot. He was a tough kid, sure, but I figured the years might cool him down. But there's been times when he's really made me blow my stack with those crazy penalties. I've always said that if he could learn to control his temper out there, he'd be a really good one. Certainly I've tried everything with him. I've pleaded with him, I yelled at him, I threatened him, and I fined him. But for a long time, nothing just seemed to make any difference. Everything went in one ear and out the other. Bartlett defended himself by claiming that his minor league reputation had made him a marked man with the referees in the NHL. After a preseason exhibition game in Ottawa, all the Rangers were on the bus for the airport. Well, everybody but Bartlett. "Where is he?" Watson barked. "I don't know," said one of the players, "but I saw him talking to his family after the game." "Well, I hope his family's got a car," Watson snapped, "so they can drive him to the airport." Fortunately for Bartlett, he did have a car and they were able to get there before the flight left, but it cost him $25 when Watson fined him. Then there was the time when Watson called a team meeting at Madison Square Garden at 9:30 in the morning, but Bartlett breezed in a half hour later. As Watson glared, Bartlett said, "Gee, Phil, I'm sorry. You know where I live, way out there on Long Island. Takes me an hour to drive it anyway, and this is the first time I drove in this early, so I didn't know the traffic was so bad, and there was an accident, and there's nothing I can do." Watson said, "It'll cost you. How much?" $25. Or the time when Jimmy Bartlett, in violation of curfew, was actually out all night, and when he was sneaking back to the hotel early in the morning, accidentally got on the same elevator with Phil Watson. "Good morning, Mr. Bartlett," Phil said. "Good morning, Coach. How much?" $25. However, no matter how much trouble Bartlett got into or how much Phil Watson yelled at him or complained about Bartlett to the press, everybody knew that Bartlett was actually teacher's pet. Even though he was only a rookie, Bartlett was still extremely cocky. Once when Andy Bathgate said, "I wish you guys would get a few goals in the third line," Bartlett responded, "Hey, never mind our goals, there were no goals against our line." Watson then butted in, barking, "All you rooks, keep your mouths shut." All the other rookies looked at each other like, what did we do? It was a glorious time to be a sports fan in New York. On October 9th, 1958, Casey Stengel won his last World Series as manager of the Yogi Berra and Mickey Mantle-led Yankees. 2 days later, in the Rangers' second game of the season playing in Boston Garden, Larry Regan of the Bruins suffered a concussion and required 6 stitches in the upper lid of his left eye, causing him to miss the next 10 games of the season, after Jimmy Bartlett dropped him directly in front of the Bruins bench from either a tossed illegal elbow check or the butt end of his stick. Everybody in the Garden saw the blatant penalty except for the referee, whose back was turned, and was powerless to call a penalty. With the unconscious Regan laying on the bloody ice, getting first aid before being taken to the hospital, the 12,000 fans in attendance started yelling, "Bartlett, Bartlett, 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 he did it, Bartlett." Milt Schmidt, the Hall of Fame coach of the Boston Bruins, started screaming at Jimmy, "You sneaky little high sticker, come here and I'll beat you up myself." Bartlett skated over to the Bruins bench and said, "Here's my jaw, you get the first punch." With his own players holding the furious Milt Schmidt back, the referee ordered Bartlett to return to the Ranger bench. "Let's go, Bartlett," the referee snapped. "Hey, Schmidt, you get the first one," Bartlett repeated. By this time, the Boston fans were on the verge of rioting. "Get away, Bartlett," the referee yelled. "Hey, Schmidt, come on." After ignoring the referee again, he was given a 10-minute misconduct and fined $25. Although Bartlett kept his photo album, scrapbooks, and trophies tucked away in the attic in various boxes throughout the years, there was one item of memorabilia that Jimmy kept sacred above all others and kept safely in the top drawer in his bedroom. Nothing validated his career as a professional athlete like his bubblegum cards. When they went temporarily missing in the mid-'80s, my dad was willing to call the FBI, Scotland Yards, and the Marines to find them. This was back before you can find them easily on the internet. On the back of one of the bubblegum cards, it said that because of Bartlett's aggressive disposition and style of skating, New York fans started to call him Crazy Horse. However, Bartlett doesn't remember ever being called Crazy Horse. He remembers being called crazy, specifically from Christmas Day, 1955, when Rocket Richard refused to fight him and Boom Boom Jefferson littered the ice with his equipment, screaming at Bartlett, "Vous crazy, vous crazy, vous crazy." But he doesn't remember the nickname Crazy Horse. The day after the Rangers won their first game of the season was the first time the New York Times referred to Jimmy Bartlett as Crazy Horse. Having 4 ties and 2 losses to begin the season, the Rangers finally got the first win of the year when they defeated Chicago 6-2 at home on October 25th, 1958. In the net, they featured Hall of Fame goalie Glenn Hall, who was selected as the NHL first All-Star team goalie 7 times, which is still an NHL record. In 1998, Glenn Hall was ranked number 16 on the Hockey News' list of the 100 greatest hockey players who ever lived. Glenn Hall's nickname was simply Mr. Goalie. In the first period, the Rangers tied the score 1-1 on a goal by Bill Gadspy with an assist by Bartlett. With winger Ron Murphy in the sin bin on a 2-minute penalty for holding, at 18:52 in the second period, Jimmy Bartlett, while on the power play and unassisted, scored the very first goal of his NHL career. It was the very first time that the fans at Madison Square Gardens were able to witness Bartlett's famous victory dance that he performed many times to the delight of the fans in Providence. With his stick raised straight up in the air over his head and hopping around on one skate, to the fans in New York, Jimmy's celebratory performance looked like a Native American war dance. Although politically incorrect by today's standards, they could have named him Geronimo or Sitting Bull instead of the great Sioux warrior Crazy Horse. The next time that Crazy Horse performed the war dance was on November 1st, 1958 in Toronto. Future Rock and Roll Hall of Famer Neil Young was 13 years old and lived in Toronto and was an avid Maple Leaf fan. I don't know whether or not he went to that game, but I do know that 10 years later, he started a band named Crazy Horse. With the score tied 2-2, the Maple Leafs went on a power play after Harry Howell got nailed for holding. Jimmy scored a shorthanded goal at 4:12 of the third period with assists from Les Colwell and Bill Gadspy. Victimizing his old friend Johnny Bower, this is the only known footage of Jimmy Bartlett ever scoring a goal that I know to be in existence.
The Rangers. Fulford is number 20. The puck goes back to Fontinato. He shot it off the boards down the ice. And it's Stanley going back for it. Puck is behind the Maple Leaf goal. Fulford has it. Fulford over to Brian Cullen. Brian Cullen now turns at his own blue line. Try to pass. Stewart carries on and Mahavlich takes it. Mahavlich skating around, gets away from one check. Still has that pass. Straight up the ice to center. Over the line, going around the defense. Still has it. Passed it out to Fulford. Fulford is checked. And the puck goes out on the left wing. Rangers in possession. Coming up to the line is Hamilton. He stick handles around with that puck to Sullivan. Sullivan gets away from the Leaf player, and the puck goes back into the Maple Leaf zone again where Stanley has it. Stanley waits. Passes it into the corner to Fulford. Fulford gets away from one check. Havlich takes over on the left wing. Goes into center. Fulford over the line. Still has that puck. Trying to pass it in front. He did. The rebound comes out, and out goes the Ranger player Colwell. A clearing pass over on the wing, cutting in as Bartlett. He scores! Bartlett picked the bottom left-hand corner to make it 3-2 New York Rangers, with the Rangers a man short. That shot seemed to fool Bauer completely. It was a perfect shot. It was low, ankle high, to the bottom left-hand corner. And Bartlett nearly jumped out of the rink when he saw that puck go in the corner to give the New York Rangers the lead for the second time.
On November 16, 1958, the sold-out capacity crowd at Madison Square Gardens was sent into a frenzy when Jimmy Bartlett scored against the defending champion Montreal Canadiens in the first 68 seconds of the game. Bartlett's quick score set off a skirmish between Red Sullivan and Dickie Moore, which then precipitated a free-for-all climaxed by a bare-knuckle fight between Louie Fontinato and Doug Harvey. After the Rocket tied the game near the end of the first period, Bathgate scored the game winner in the second period, and the third period remained scoreless as the Rangers won 2-1 for their fourth win in a row. Bartlett's goal against Hall of Fame goalie Jacques Plante, who won the Vezina Trophy 7 times, was particularly sweet because it was against his former team, the team that allowed the Rangers to poach him in 1955. On November 26, 1958, Maurice the Rocket Richard became the first player in history to score 600 goals in his career. After receiving a vicious body check by Claude Provost, Crazy Horse KO'd Provost in a fast exchange that saw Jimmy do all the punching. Later in the second period, Jimmy scored the winning goal after racing down the right boards and taking a shot from an impossible angle that caught goalie Jacques Plante completely off guard. The Rockets' celebratory night was ruined by Bartlett's goal, which resulted in the Rangers' third consecutive win against the world champion Habs. On December 3rd, 1958, the Rangers defeated the Blackhawks 4-2 and moved into third place. In the second period, Bathgate took a pass from Hank Sessler, who fed it to Jimmy Bartlett, who found the back of the net against Glenn Hall. With his assist, Bathgate became the 7th Ranger to amass a career total of 300 or more points. After winning the World Series in 1958, New York also attempted to win the NFL championship that year. However, on December 28, 1958, the Baltimore Colts defeated the New York Giants at Yankee Stadium in a game which has been called the greatest game ever played. Johnny Unitas invented the 2-minute drill, and Alan the Horse Amici became the first person to ever score a touchdown in the playoffs in sudden death overtime. Jimmy Bartlett was fined $25 for his part in a bench-clearing brawl that occurred on January 3rd, 1959 in a game between the first-place Canadians and the second-place Rangers. Jimmy drew a double major for fighting and charging and was given a 10-minute misconduct. According to President Clarence Campbell, the league rules required an automatic fine. Here's what happened. The Canadians were winning 5-0 with 25 seconds left of the game. Jimmy Bartlett was buzzing around the Canadians' net with his stick swooping close to Jacques Plante's head like a mosquito in the dark. The great goalie knew it was there, but he didn't know where, and besides, he was concentrating on preserving his 5-0 shutout in the final minute of the game. That's when Louie Fontinato's screened 40-footer surprisingly found the back of the net. And that's when Bartlett started his obnoxious cackling.
Lost your bonus for another shutout. Hey, Plant, isn't that just too bad?
That's when Plant took a poke at Bartlett, who then violently responded, and the two of them tumbled to the ice in a flailing frenzy of sticks, skates, pads, and punches. Both benches cleared at the end of the game, and everybody was involved in the fight with the exception of Gump Worsley. On January 11th, 1959, Jimmy took a pass from Les Colwell and scored the first goal of the game against Glen Hall in the Rangers' 4-3 come-from-behind victory. Bartlett received a double minor for roughing and charging after pinning Danny Lewicki against the crossbar of the goal. On January 15th, 1959, Muzz Patrick announced that at the end of the season, the New York Rangers and the Boston Bruins would be heading to Europe, where they would play 23 exhibition games in 8 different countries. Each player would receive about $1,000, which was basically less than $50 a game. In order to get his players ready for the stretch drive in the season, Watson gave his team a mini vacation. However, all of the rookies decided to blow off the vacation and instead stay and work. This hard work paid off on January 25th, 1959, when the rookies combined for 5 of the goals in the January 25th 8-3 blowout of the Boston Bruins. Bartlett assisted on a shorthanded goal by Les Colwell and scored his first career goal against the Boston Bruins after taking a pass from Hank Sisla and beating goaltender Don Simmons. By the end of January, the Rangers were sitting pretty with a record 3 points better than the previous season at that time. Phil Watson was confident that he and Muzz made the right decision at the beginning of the year to push the rookies. On March 8, 1971, Joe Frazier fought Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight championship of the world at Madison Square Gardens in a fight that's been called the fight of the century. 12 years earlier, on February 1st, 1959, Madison Square Gardens was the setting for the hockey fight of the century. With the Rangers taking a 2-0 lead, Bartlett was sent off the ice halfway through the first period after a 2-minute minor for high sticking. Bartlett was punished for his sins when Gordie Howe immediately responded with a power play goal. Shortly thereafter, Eddie Shack sent defenseman Warren Godfrey into the hospital with a concussion after an uncalled elbow to the head. In response, Gordie Howe then cross-checked Eddie Shack in the head, causing him to get 3 stitches. Again, no penalty was called. Today, nobody remembers the fact that the Rangers won that game 5-4. All they remember is the fight. In retaliation for Gordie Howe's vicious cross-check to the head of the young Ranger rookie, reigning hockey heavyweight champion of the world, Leapin' Louie Fontinato, wasted no time in unleashing a fury of punches on Gordie Howe. Somehow avoiding being knocked out, Gordie instead became incensed, grabbed Fontinato's sweater with one hand, and fired back repeatedly with the other. With a noise that was described as the sound of an axe chopping wood, Gordie connected with an uppercut that made Fontinato's face explode and left his nose at a grotesque 45-degree angle. Mr. Hockey, Gordie Howe, was now the undisputed NHL heavyweight champion, a title that he never relinquished, even when compared with future sluggers like Dave the Hammer Schultz and Bob Probert. On February 5th, 1959, Gump Worsley shut out the Detroit Red Wings in a road game with the help of Red Sullivan, who scored 2 goals. Jimmy did not accomplish anything significant in that game because his mind was elsewhere. because back at home on that same day, Jimmy's wife Helen gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl who they named Melinda. Although Jimmy was in Detroit at the time of her birth, from the moment he first saw her, she became the apple of her father's eye. Unfortunately for the New York Rangers fans, and to the chagrin of Coach Phil Watson, the Rangers lost their next 6 games in a row. On February 8, 1959, the Bruins defeated the Rangers 4-1 behind Bronco Horvath's hat trick. Jimmy scored the only goal for the Rangers. Coach Watson did everything he could to try to inspire the team to do better, and even threatened to cancel the trip to Europe unless the team's performance dramatically improved. After a 30-minute team meeting in the dressing room, each member of the team was called in to the office by Muzz Patrick and Phil Watson, who interrogated each member individually, one by one. The Gump got the biggest tongue lashing, and Jimmy had the shortest session because Jimmy had to take Helen and Melinda home from the hospital to their home in Long Beach, Long Island. Because after all, a new father deserves some consideration. On February 11th, 1959, the Bruins again defeated the Rangers, even though Jimmy Bartlett scored a goal in the first 62 seconds of the game. Jimmy's goal was unassisted when he broke loose on a breakaway and was able to beat Donnie Simmons one-on-one. After returning to the bench and getting congratulated by his team, Jimmy turned to the captain, Red Sullivan, and said,
"You know, when I'm in there, I never miss."
"Is that so, Jim?" Red asked.
"Absolutely. I never miss."
After that, Red Sullivan, of course, started calling Bartlett Never Miss. Red Sullivan got a kick out of Bartlett's cockiness and refusal to take a back seat to anyone. According to Red, this is probably because he had so much experience playing in the minors, unlike most rookies. Sullivan credited Bartlett with being the steady influence on the third line and for using his experience to cover for the other rookies' mistakes. Jimmy was also popular with his teammates because he was the holler guy on the team, the guy who would motivate the other players to succeed in between shifts.
"Come on, someone's got one. Someone's got a goal in their stick. Someone's got one. So let's find it."
On February 12, 1959, Marcel Pronovost of the Detroit Red Wings received a penalty for tripping against Jimmy Bartlett. Bartlett didn't mind, though, because the photograph of the trip was later used by Topps for yet another bubblegum card that Jimmy proudly put into his collection. On February 15th at Madison Square Gardens, after Camille Henry scored a second-period goal, the Gumper had Montreal shut out with 10 minutes remaining. However, the Canadiens then scored 5 goals in the last 10 minutes of the game to win 5-1. Coach Watson blew a gasket and screamed at the top of his lungs at his players and ordered every single one of them, except Gump Worsley, out on the ice for an immediate after-game workout. For once, Watson wasn't pissed off at Worsley, who he said didn't play so badly. General Manager Muzz Patrick said the workout was in lieu of fines. Most of the players on the team felt that Watson's display of anger was counterproductive and actually contributed to the team's late-season collapse. In the Rangers' bid to make the playoffs, Phil Watson called their upcoming game against Detroit that occurred on February 25th, 1959, as the big one. In the net, the Detroit Red Wings featured the best goalie in the world, Terry Sawchuk. When Terry Sawchuk eventually retired, he had the record for most career wins and shutouts until it was broken by Marty Brodeur in 2009. Andy Bathgate had a fantastic 4-point game in the Rangers' 6-3 win at the Garden. Taking a feed from Andy Bathgate during a line change, Bartlett beat Sawchuk for the Rangers' final goal of the night, and Bartlett's first ever career goal against the Red Wings. On February 28, 1959, Jean Beliveau got the hat trick at the Montreal Forum in the Habs' 6-1 blowout over the Rangers. With approximately 5 minutes left in the game, a fight between John Hanna and Ralph Backstrom turned into a 10-minute bench-clearing brawl, in which Dickie Moore, Jean Beliveau, Ralph Backstrom, Marcel Bonin, Jean-Guy Talbot, and Ian Cushman took turns pairing off against the rookie duo of Jimmy Bartlett and John Hannah. Bartlett, of course, received the 10-minute misconduct. With 5 games left in the season, the Rangers were sitting with a 7-point lead over the Toronto Maple Leafs for the final playoff spot. Fighting elimination, Toronto shut out the Rangers at home 5-0 on March 14, 1959. In the second period, after viciously checking Larry Regan of Toronto into the boards, Louie Fontinato was given a 5-minute major penalty. Shortly after play resumed, Hank Sesla and Frank Mahavlich started going at each other, and players on both clubs started fighting. After being heckled by fans while sitting in the penalty box, an enraged Leapin' Louie attempted to climb into the stands. As Fontinato was being restrained by a police officer and fans, Ranger defenseman Bill Gadspy and Jimmy Bartlett barged through the penalty box door from the ice and went to help Louie, with the officials on the ice chasing after them. After Mark Rome of Toronto and Eddie Shack started teeing off on each other, players from both benches rushed to the ice as pandemonium broke out.
Still trying to mix it up with Rayom. Shack has been thrown out of the game. Rayom is being pulled over to the bench. Now then Fontinato's trying to get at some fans. Ranger players all gather around, and we have a regular Donnybrook. They're all gathered around at the penalty box, and Puffer took a swipe at the Ranger player. And Olmsted gets him around the neck. Mahavlich has a hold of Shack, and we have a regular free-for-all.
Surprisingly, Jimmy Bartlett did not receive any penalties at all in this game. For once, he controlled his temper and remained basically calm during all the chaos. With only 4 games remaining, Toronto and the Rangers played each other for the last time on March 15, 1959. A win in this game would clinch the Rangers a spot in the playoffs. The Leafs' George Armstrong had a shorthanded goal to give them a 2-1 lead heading into the second period. Although Andy Bathgate tied the score at 2 with his 40th goal of the season, Frank Mahavlich's goal 12 seconds later and George Armstrong's second goal of the game then gave the Leafs a 2-goal lead. At 14:32 of the second period, Jimmy Bartlett scored with an assist from rookie John Hannah to close the gap. 8 seconds later, the Rangers apparently scored the tying goal, but Red Story disallowed it. Bartlett was giving a 10-minute misconduct by the referee for verbalizing his opinion of the referee's decision. After Hank Sesla tied up the score with the goal in the third period, the Leafs took a 5-4 lead at 12:40 after George Armstrong's hat trick. However, 2.5 minutes later, Madison Square Garden erupted when their own red-headed captain, Red Sullivan, tied the score up with only 5 minutes to play. With New York needing only 1 goal to clinch the playoffs, at 17:54, a very weak shot by the Maple Leafs' Bob Holford slipped by Gump Worsley and gave the Leafs a stay of execution. It's a wonder that Coach Phil Watson's brain did not literally explode as he watched Gump Worsley have one of the worst games of his career. On March 18th, in a game against the Boston Bruins, the Rangers gave up the first 4 goals at home in their 5-3 loss. Despite the Rangers' losing streak, the team was still optimistic that they would make the playoffs because the Toronto Maple Leafs had a must-win game on March 19th that was scheduled to be played in Montreal against the defending champion Canadiens. However, the 1958-59 season must have been cursed against the Rangers. Hall of Fame goalie Jacques Plante could not play in that game due to a severe case of boils. Instead, the starting goalie for the Canadiens was Claude Pronovost, who had previously played only 80 minutes in his entire NHL career. After the Leafs blew out the Habs 6-3, Pronovost never played another game in the NHL. The last day of the hockey season was March 22nd, 1959. The Rangers would make the playoffs with either a win or a loss by Toronto. With Plant still unable to play and the Canadians giving up on Pronovo, the Habs started Charlie Hodge, who they had called up from the Montreal Royals of the Quebec Hockey League to be their starting goalie in the last game of the season. In that game, Montreal's Dickie Moore had a goal and an assist and broke the NHL single-season record for points in a season that was previously held by Gordie Howe. Unfortunately for the Rangers, Charlie Hodge was brilliant in the net and defeated New York at home 4-2. The Rangers still had a prayer of making the playoffs because the Leafs still had the difficult task of beating the Red Wings in Detroit. After taking a 3-0 lead at home, the Red Wings completely collapsed and lost to the Maple Leafs 6-4. Despite Andy Bathgate's brilliant MVP performance, the New York Rangers did not make the playoffs. In the first round of the playoffs, the Maple Leafs were able to defeat the Bruins in 7 games. However, it only took the Montreal Canadiens 5 games to defeat the Maple Leafs in the finals for their 4th consecutive Stanley Cup. In the 1970s, the World Hockey Association was established in an attempt to challenge the NHL for hockey supremacy. When the Michigan Stags folded with only 17 games left to play in the season, the league took over ownership of the team and renamed them and moved them to Baltimore, where they finished the season as the Baltimore Blades. On February 8, 1975, my dad took us to the Civic Center to see the Blades play the Winnipeg Jets. After the game was over, my dad took me down to the dressing room, and the goalie for the Jets, Joe Daly, who had played with Bartlett with the Clippers, autographed and gave me his goalie stick. My dad also introduced me to his Winnipeg Jets teammate and one of the greatest hockey players who ever lived, the Golden Jet himself, Bobby Hall. Hall was going to give me a stick as well, but being a 9-year-old kid, I really liked the goalie stick better, so I just had Bobby sign the stick that Daly gave me. My dad and Bobby Hall became friends in 1959 when they became temporary teammates with the New York Rangers in Europe. Despite the Rangers' late season collapse and Watson's threats to cancel the tour, the arrangements had already been made and too much money had been invested for that threat to have been taken seriously. Although the Boston Bruins and the New York Rangers were exhausted after playing an entire season, the Swiss winemakers who promoted the European tour had the team scheduled to play 23 games in only 26 days. Although ice hockey was popular in Europe, the fans were completely unfamiliar with the style of hockey that was played in the NHL. The only glimpse of NHL hockey that Europe had ever seen occurred more than 20 years earlier in 1938 when the Montreal Canadiens and Detroit Red Wings played a 9-game series of exhibition games in Paris and London. Playing on a larger surface than in America, the European game was cleaner and valued fast skating and creativity over the hard-checking violent style that was more popular in North America. Overall, the tour itself was a failure. Attendance was very erratic. Sometimes the teams played in front of full houses, other times attendance was embarrassingly small. The league tried out a new experimental puck that was black on the top and bottom, but bright orange on the sides. The league thought that it could help fans see the puck easier, but the players complained that it looked just like a blur on the ice. The NHL players were frequently booed by the European fans who did not really appreciate the tight-checking physicality of the NHL. However, the players on the two teams had a fantastic time and loved the trip. Back in the day before players were millionaires, most of the guys on the two teams could never afford a trip to Europe. And although the two coaches, Phil Watson and Milt Schmidt, encouraged the players to take the game seriously, everybody knew that the games were all exhibitions and really didn't matter. For the most part, the players were there to have a good time and to see the sights. Jerry Topazzini of the Bruins and Louie Fontinato visited the birthplaces of their parents in Italy after the exhibition tour concluded. Although Fernie Flaman's wife joined him after the tour for a vacation, for the most part, the wives and the girlfriends all stayed home. Overall, the players engaged in a lot of drinking, partying, and entertaining the young mademoiselles and frauleins. Just like Vegas, whatever happened in Europe would stay in Europe. After winning the MVP, an exhausted Andy Bathgate decided not to make the trip but stay with his wife in Vancouver because she had just had a baby. To fill out the roster, the Rangers decided to take 4 players from the Chicago Blackhawks with them on the tour. Eddie Litzenberger, Eric Nestorenko, and future Hall of Famers Pierre Pilote and Bobby Hall were all members of the New York Rangers for the 1959 European Tour. Although the tour was a disaster financially, it was an overwhelming success in one regard. One of the young players on Phil Watson's European New York Rangers team metamorphosized from being a pretty good, solid player to developing into one of the greatest hockey players who's ever lived. Unfortunately for Phil Watson, once the tour was over, Bobby Hall was heading home to Chicago, not to New York. During the 58-59 season, Bobby Hall scored a solid 18 goals on the second line, centering for Ron Murphy and Eric Nestorenko. However, no one would have foreseen at the time that Bobby Hall would eventually lead the NHL and WHA 8 times in goals for an incredible career total of 913, trailing only Wayne Gretzky and Gordie Howe, and signing hockey's very first $1 million contract. In Europe, Coach Watson put Bobby Hall on a line with Eddie Litzenberger from the Hawks and with Eddie Shack. Shack drove Hall crazy because, according to Hall, Eddie was all over the ice and Hall had to give him instructions on where to play every single shift. But it worked, and Bobby Hall was a scoring machine over in Europe. Hall claimed that the lack of pressure allowed him to experiment and that the big rinks gave him room to skate and shoot, and it just all came together. And if he hadn't made the trip to Europe and played as well as he did, gaining all that confidence, who knows where my career would have gone. Although he must have been disappointed to lose Hall at the end of the trip, Coach Watson must have been proud of Jimmy Bartlett, who scored the second most goals on the Rangers team during the European Tour. On April 28, 1959, Jimmy Bartlett and the New York Rangers took a TWA transatlantic flight from New York to London. On the next day, the Boston Bruins rallied from a 4-goal deficit to defeat the Rangers 7-5, as Major League Hockey was played in the UK for the first time since before World War II. Because the promoters doubled the admission price, fans boycotted the game and only 1,500 people attended Game 1 that was played at Wembley's Empire Pool. It didn't take long for the Europeans to be exposed to the North American style of violent, hardcore hockey. Playing in the city of his father's birth, in out-of-control Bartlett received a 10-minute misconduct in the first period. On the next night, the Rangers tied up the series 1 game apiece with a 4-3 victory after the Rangers took a 2-0 lead in the first period, behind the first goal scored of the series by Bobby Hall and by Ranger farmhand Gordon Lavoisier, with an assist by Hank Ciesla and Jimmy Bartlett. The teams were given a day off before traveling to Geneva, Switzerland. On May 2nd, the Rangers defeated the Bruins 4-3. In the first of 9 back-to-back consecutive games that the Rangers and Bruins will play over the next 9 days without a single day off, the longest consecutive game streak in professional hockey history. After that game was over, Bruins player Branko Horvath told his coach Milt Schmidt that he wasn't going to play anymore in the series because of the constant headhunting by the New York Rangers. As a result of this, captains Fernie Flaman of the Bruins and Red Sullivan of the Rangers had a Geneva convention of their own and agreed to tone down the violence because, after all, this was just supposed to be a series of exhibition games. On May 3rd, 6,000 fans jam-packed the Geneva Ice Stadium as the Bruins blew out the Rangers 12-4 behind Johnny Busick's hat trick. Jimmy scored an unassisted, meaningless goal with only 2 seconds left of the game. Next, the tour took them to Paris, France, where the two coaches, Milt Schmidt and Phil Watson, went out drinking together. When Phil Watson tried to show off by ordering a beer in French, the bartenders could not understand his French-Canadian dialect. So Milt Schmidt ordered the beer in German, which ironically they could understand. Bobby Hall was so excited to see Paris that he actually climbed the Eiffel Tower, running up the steps one by one. I guess that's one way that Bobby Hall developed his legendary speed that rivaled Connor McDavid and Paul Coffey as the fastest in NHL history. In the first game played in Paris, the Rangers won 6-2 with Bartlett getting 2 assists. The next night, the Rangers lost 6-4 despite Jimmy scoring a goal with an assist by Hank Ciesla. After leaving Paris, the teams next headed to Belgium where they played 3 games in Antwerp. In the first game, the Bruins scored 4 goals in the second period and went on to defeat the Rangers 6-3. It was an embarrassment to the NHL that only 500 fans turned out to watch that game. Dean Prentice and Blackhawk Eddie Litzenberger each had 2 goals in the Rangers' 6-3 win in the second game of the Antwerp series. Only 800 fans showed up for the New York Rangers' 8-4 victory in the final game of the Belgian leg of the tour, in which Bartlett scored a goal in the second period. Next up on the agenda, 2 games in Zurich, Switzerland. By this time in the tour, the 2 teams were exhausted. They had just played 7 games in 7 days, in 3 different countries without a day off. It was also getting more and more difficult to take the games seriously when in places like Belgium, less than 1,000 people were showing up for each of the games. When Bobby Hall returned home after the tour, he told his father that the next season he would lead the NHL in scoring. His dad said, "Yeah, you and how many other guys?" But Bobby Hall wasn't just bragging, because in 1959-60, he led the league in both points and goals. Although Bobby Hall later credited the tour with his increase in productivity because the lack of pressure and the larger ice surfaces, this doesn't really account for the development of the biggest weapon in Bobby Hall's arsenal, his world-famous slap shot. Although Boom Boom Geoffrion is generally credited with inventing the slap shot, it was Bobby Hall who perfected it and made it world-famous. Like everyone else in the NHL, prior to the trip in Europe, Bobby Hall scored most of his goals primarily with a wrist shot. However, according to my dad, everything changed on May 9th, 1959 in Zurich, Switzerland, when the Rangers won the 10th game of the series in a come-from-behind victory 7-6. According to Bartlett, Bobby Hall was severely hungover to begin that game. After playing 7 games in 7 days and running up the Eiffel Tower step by step, Bobby Hall was completely exhausted and could barely stand up on his skates. Instead of using his blinding speed, whenever Bobby got the puck, he simply wound up and slapped it as hard as he could. The missed shot hit the boards with a loud bang, and everybody in the arena went, "Ooh." The second time he got the puck, he fired again, hit the boards with a loud bang, and everybody went, "Ah." The third time Bobby Hall got the puck, he slapped it in and found the back of the net, and the 5,000 fans in Zurich exploded with enthusiasm. The Golden Jet scored 4 goals in that game. According to Bartlett, the modern-day slap shot was not developed after careful scientific analysis or coaching inspiration, but merely because Bobby Hall was too hungover and tired to skate. The Rangers lost the last game they played in Switzerland 4-2, despite a goal by Jimmy Bartlett with an assist by Red Sullivan and Pierre Palat. After that game, the teams were finally given a day off before resuming the tour in Germany with 6 consecutive games. On May 12, 1959, the Rangers won 4-2 in the first game played in Dortmund, Germany. Bartlett scored a goal with an assist from Colwill and Sullivan, and also assisted in a goal scored by Red Sullivan. On the next night in Dortmund, the Rangers lost 6-4, despite Bartlett scoring another goal with an assist from Ciesla and assisting on another goal by Red Sullivan. On May 14th, the Bruins scored 5 goals in the first period and beat the Rangers 6-4 in the first of 2 games played in the city of Essen, with Bartlett picking up an assist on a goal by Ciesla. On the next night, Red Armstrong broke a 3-3 tie with a late third period goal to give the Rangers a win. On May 16th, 1959, in the first game played in Krefeld, Jimmy Bartlett and Eddie Litzenberger each scored 2 goals in the Rangers' 8-0 shutout victory. Bartlett scored again the next night, and Dean Prentice found the back of the net twice in the Rangers' 7-2 victory. After getting a day off, the teams next headed to Berlin, where they played a 3-game series. The first game was played on May 19, 1959, and ended in a 6-6 tie. This game was played during the height of the Cold War. The free city of West Berlin was located in the communist country of East Germany. Bombed out buildings were everywhere. The Soviet Union's Secretary General Khrushchev had given an ultimatum to the West to withdraw from Berlin by May 1st, 1959. This heightened tension between the two superpowers would eventually lead to the construction of the Berlin Wall. Only about 500 spectators went to the first game because they complained that the prices of tickets were too high. The Rangers won the next game 3-2 in a game in which Bobby Hall scored twice. The Bruins defeated the Rangers 8-2 before 1,000 fans in the final match of their 3-game exhibition series in West Berlin. On May 22nd, the two teams traveled to Vienna, Austria to begin the final 3 games of the tour. At the end of World War II, the city of Vienna was divided and occupied by the Soviets and the Allies. Although no longer occupied by the time of the exhibition series, because the city of Vienna declared itself neutral in the conflict between the West and the Soviets, the city had a unique international vibe. Walter Schwartz, the sports editor of Austria's largest newspaper, attended the first game between the Bruins and Rangers in Vienna that ended in a 2-2 tie. In his opinion, if the Soviets and the NHL ever matched up, the Russians will be chased out of the rink by these hockey players. In regards to speed, lightning-fast reactions, body control, and sheer physical power, the North Americans have no equals. The Bruins won the second game played in Vienna 5-3 behind 2 goals scored by Don McKinney. In attendance at that game was Václav Surovsky, coach of the Czechoslovakia national team. When asked how he thought his team might fare against the NHL clubs, Surovsky said, "We would have a good first period against them, would get frightened in the second, and collapse in the third." The final game of the tour ended in a 4-4 tie in front of 1,000 Viennese fans. Of the 23 matches played between the two teams, the Rangers won 11, the Bruins 9, and 3 were tied. At the end of the game, Captain Red Sullivan of the Rangers received a big cup for his team's victory in the series. On May 26, the teams flew back to Geneva, where they would have a couple of days off before ending the trip with a team banquet. During the European trip, Bartlett would write letters back home to Eddie Shack's family because Eddie was basically illiterate. All of the Rangers players had matching New York blazers that they were supposed to wear to the banquet at the end of the tour. Shortly before the dinner, Eddie Shack had a rendezvous with a young Swiss woman. Lacking a blanket and in a very noble display of chivalry, Eddie put his team blazer on the ground for the young lady's comfort. When Shack eventually caught up with the rest of his team, he was greeted with howls of laughter and ridicule because Eddie Shack didn't realize that the back of his blazer resembled Monica Lewinsky's infamous blue dress. On May 28th, the day after Jimmy Bartlett's 27th birthday, the team flew back home to New York. The long season was finally over, but the neon lights remained bright on Broadway.